Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name's Charles Godfrey. I'm the director. And it's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker this morning, Professor Paul Behrens. And Paul's going to be talking towards a livable planet, energy and food systems transitions. Paul did his undergraduate at Sheffield and then did a PhD in Auckland, has gone on to work in New Zealand and the Netherlands. And currently, we're lucky enough to have him in Oxford for 4 years. He has a very prestigious position of a British Academy Global Professor. Paul is very distinguished for his work in many fields, but especially in food systems, and is the winner of the Frontiers Planet Prize. Paul is also very interested in the public understanding of science and engaging with broader publics, and particularly recommend his book, The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, Futures from the Frontiers of Climate Science. Paul, we're looking forward to your talk.
Thanks so much. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for turning out on such a cold, crisp day. I'll be telling you a little bit about the position that we're at right now in terms of the climate crisis and weaving in some of our research as we go, talking mainly about energy and food transitions. So what I want to start you off with is the picture of where we're at today. And one thing I want to impress upon everybody is that we have systemically underestimated the impacts of climate change. We've done extremely well at estimating the temperatures, almost spot on, although the last couple of years have been a bit of a scare. But in terms of the impacts on the economy, on the ecology, on us, have been underestimated. And to show this, what I've done here is I've taken the so-called burning embers plots from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And each of these burning embers plots on the left here, going from left to right, are for each consequential IPCC report. So we've got one in 2001, 2009, 2014, 2022. And what you see here are the aggregate impacts. So these are the aggregate economic and ecological impacts at different degrees of temperature on the global mean temperature change. And on the right, we've got the large-scale discontinuities. And these are these big tipping elements around the world: the loss of Greenland's ice sheet, the loss of glaciers, the shifting of ocean currents. And what we can see in both of these cases is that what we thought would be happening at just above 3 degrees of centigrade in 2001 is now estimated to be below 2 degrees by 2022. Okay? And that continues to drop over time. It's the same with the large-scale discontinuities, but that drop has been even faster for the potential of these large-scale tipping points that you might have heard about, these big changes in the global system. And there we've seen a change from just above 5 degrees down towards 2 degrees. In fact, the stuff that we thought would be happening at about 3.5 degrees of warming is now solidly in the danger zone of where we are today at 1.2, 2.3 degrees of warming. So there's been this underestimation over time. We're, of course, in the UK, and I want to show a similar sort of perspective here in the climate change risk assessments over time. So in the blue bars here, I've got the risk assessments in 2012, and in the red bars, I've got the risk assessment in 2021. And whilst we can see these low and medium risks have come down, actually what's happened is they've translated to higher and very high risks as time has gone on. Now, these very high risks equate to economic damages of above £1 billion per year by, I should say, 2050, under 2 degrees of warming. Okay, the next thing I want to show you here is the historical emissions on the left. And we can see those historical emissions and what would have to happen to meet 1.5 degrees. Now, this is just to have a chance of 1.5 degrees, 67% chance. And what's happening here is that the emissions are coming down, but the longer that we delay meeting net zero, the more and more negative emissions we need in the future, drawing carbon out in the future. So we're emitting it today to give future generations a horrible problem to deal with in terms of drawing that extra carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, if we were to do that using some technologies, these would be a complete catastrophe for nature and for the environment. Now, one of the ones that was talked about a lot is bioenergy carbon capture and sequestration. This is where you grow your trees, you chop them down, you burn the trees, you capture the CO2. The CO2 goes underground and you store that CO2 underground. Now, if we were relying on bioenergy carbon capture and sequestration and we delayed until later this century, you're talking an area the size of 1 to 2 times the size of the EU would need just for this mechanism of drawing down enough carbon to make 1.5 degrees. And so this is where a lot of the existential monsters for human civilization come from. How large will this overshoot be? How large will we go over 1.5 degrees only to have to bring it back by the end of the century? And how large are some of these technologies going to have to be in order to bring that back? You can imagine if we're developing 1 to 2 times the size of the EU just for this one purpose of drawing down carbon, that's a biodiversity disaster, of course. Now, also underneath this is a lot of heroic assumptions that we will not see, we see further tipping of other elements around the climate system in the world. So really, we are playing Russian roulette with our future if we're delaying and relying on these technologies. It also requires heroic assumptions on the progression of those technologies and the cost of those technologies. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Because essentially, the things that we need to do to reduce emissions now are so beneficial, and these technologies so expensive in the future, it's a drag on economies. It's stuff that we don't need to do if we were to sort out the things that we know we need to do today and the stuff that will actually improve lives around the world. By the way, I've put the national targets, the latest national targets from the Climate Action Tracker in orange there, and you can see just how far we are off, even on this delayed trajectory. So if we were to get these reductions for 1.5 degrees, we would need reductions of at least 20% per year for reasonable shots at 1.5 without this overshoot, without gambling on these sort of existential monsters. And we'd need at least 7 to 10% per year for 2 degrees. So we need something, approaching sort of COVID-style reductions in emissions. Now, methane emissions, I should say further methane emissions from agriculture and fossil fuels can help because these so-called short-lived climate forces have a very strong warming effect in the near term. And so that can buy us more time in order to not overshoot quite as much. And so we need those too. What this ultimately implies for the increasing impacts of climate change that have been underestimated over time is more and more risks towards the foundations of human society. And one of those, of course, is in food systems. And the emergence of the climate signal on food systems has come earlier than we thought. And the emergence of extreme weather events on food system is also surprisingly high. So one study, this is work out from the University of Oxford, found that the chance of increasing breadbasket failure goes up the warmer that we get. Now, breadbasket failure could be a reduction of around 10% in multiple breadbaskets around the world in 1 year. So multiple extreme events hitting multiple regions at the same time. So for maize, which is the most sensitive crop, the chances before climate change, so back in the Holocene that we just left, back last century, we would get a breadbasket failure once every 16 years. That goes up to once every 3 years at 1.5 degrees and once every 2 years at 2 degrees. Now, this is one study, okay, so we need many more studies, but other studies are showing a similar jump from pre-climate change to 1.5 degrees, that similar sort of scale of a jump. For soy, it's less of a jump. It's from every 20 years to once every 9 years, and at 2 degrees, once every 7 years. And what this tells and sort of suggests to me is actually the period that we're moving through now, as we move from 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 degrees, is one of the sort of areas which will see this biggest impact on the agricultural systems. And we need to be aware of these changes. I mean, we've seen this in Oxford, obviously, in the flooding recently, where a number of farms saw their stock demolished by flooding. Now, how I see this playing out, now, things will get a little bit more upbeat in a moment. I'll go to what we can actually do about this. So we were just setting the scene a little bit here in terms of just how much is at stake. And I'm sure many of you already know these things, but we need to keep reminding ourselves what's at stake and what's coming in the short term, in sort of in the medium term. Because, I think, feeling doom and that nothing can change is obviously really damaging, but it is important that it's not an amorphous doom, that we know what's kind of coming and then what we can do about it. So the way I sort of see it coming in the future is that all these pressures, to food systems, to infrastructure, these climate impacts across different countries, especially in high-income nations, will push up the cost of living. And we've always seen changes in the cost of living over time. You see oil price strikes, you see ups and downs in geopolitics. And so we see these variations. But what climate change does is it constantly pushes that extra pressure on those variations. And so as we start to get higher cost of living, you might see strikes. I mean, we saw plenty of strikes in the UK after Ukraine, after the increasing cost of living there. And, some estimates suggest that the actual increases in food price inflation that we've seen, a third of that was driven by climate impacts on the food system. So it's really important to remember that. Yes, the largest amount was from energy prices and geopolitical instability, but climate change is that constant ramping up of those cost of living issues. And we get food riots, which we see often in middle and lower income nations when food prices increase. It wasn't reported on as much in the media, but many countries around the world, Indonesia, many Latin American countries, saw food riots during the COVID period as prices increased. There was instability. And then ultimately we had this political instability. Now that's obviously all the negative side of things. So what can we do about this, and where are we going? Well, work that we did back in 2022 was to take a statistical projection of what has happened in the past in terms of emissions, in terms of how we've reduced emissions in different sectors, and what will happen in the future. So just looking at the rate of change in those emissions and the rate of change in emissions over time. And what we came up with was this projected result here. So we can see this peaking towards the 2025, sort of 2030 period, and then this sort of slow decline afterwards to 2050. Now, this is below a lot of the worst case scenarios of the IPCC. So the IPCC have these scenarios that, go way up above 4 degrees and some really positive scenarios at 1.5 degrees. So we've avoided some of these very high impact scenarios. And according to our projections, we're even potentially lower than some other projections out there that we could be reaching about 2.7 degrees towards the end of the century. But what I really want to emphasize here is, whilst we've systemically underestimated how fast climate change can hit us, that means that these middle-of-the-road scenarios are now a disaster. So because of these extra impacts, because of this unanticipated difficulty with dealing with these impacts, even these middle-of-the-road scenarios are a problem. And this is work with Yuan Rong, a PhD student who worked on this. So it's very late in the day. Here's the more upbeat stuff. So we can all have a sigh and move on to some of the upbeat research out there. And this ultimately comes down to two areas of transition, and that's energy and food systems. These systems, they drive, well, they're the foundations of society. I mean, materials is another area that I work on that I won't mention today, but if you want to talk to me about it afterwards, we can talk about materials. But these are the two major areas which are driving most of our problems. So let's talk about energy first. Well, many of you will already know, and I think this is now actually getting out in the media so that most people around the country now know this. But when you compare the levelized cost of electricity for coal and gas, which has not changed over this time at all, and we compare that to renewables, wind and we compare that to solar, we've seen these dramatic drops. And such is the case now that wind and solar, even new wind and solar, is cheaper than existing coal and gas in many areas of the world. It is now cheaper to build new wind and solar than it is to continue operating coal and gas. And you might think, well, why are places still running this if that's true? And a lot of the cases, it's the political inertia, it's the infrastructural inertia, it's the social inertia about having to run those systems. Now, one of the things I think that is underappreciated is that the answer is electrification, electrification, electrification. We need to electrify almost everything. And this is a study that came out in 2018. So the picture looks probably even rosier now, even better now. And what they did in this publication is they looked at what are the easy to decarbonize areas and what are the hard to decarbonize areas. The easy to decarbonize areas are in blue, and the hard to decarbonize areas are in red here. And you can notice straight away that the hard to decarbonize areas are just much smaller, aren't they? They are in the order of 20 to 30% of what we need to decarbonize is hard to decarbonize. Now, it's important to bear in mind that we do have technologies for these last sectors, but they currently are more expensive. So if we wanted to go down the path and actually decarbonize everything, we could. We have the technologies. We've got all the solutions. But those 30%, 20 to 30% is more expensive. And the rest is just super cheap. And since 2018, those sectors have got smaller and smaller. We keep kind of getting surprised about how good electrification is. It keeps kind of sneaking up on us and going, oh, it's getting even cheaper. Oh, we can actually use it for this. You know, a good example is long-haul trucking, which everybody thought, oh, we'll probably need to use something like hydrogen for that. Actually, it's looking more and more like it might be batteries. So we're kind of underestimating how much this can help. And of course, this has huge impacts on air pollution across countries. When we're talking millions of people dying prematurely every year from air pollution, there's just another extra area in terms of this transition being healthier for people and basically paying for itself. I mean, a lot of the research now shows that it's actually net positive in terms of the economics of the transition. And this is what I want to move into next. We also underestimate the energy transition as a whole. On the right here, we've got a number of different projections from the International Energy Agency in blue. And the projection is made in each of those years, and you can see the lines coming out. This is what they thought in each year would be the gigawatts of solar added per year. And you can see how flat these lines are. And then you can see the red of where we're actually going in terms of these rollouts. Now, there was one year, for example, where I think it was the IEA had an estimate that we would have, I can't remember how many gigawatts it was, but some amount of gigawatts by 2030, and it was beaten a year later. So there is this massive rollout of energy. So the energy transition, in my mind, is kind of done. It's about how fast it goes rather than whether it will get done. The energy transition is also cheaper than we think. And this is other work from Oxford again. And what you see here is the scenario cost. So this is the cost of each of the different transitions if you go from a no transition to a slow transition to a fast transition. And what you see are the fast transitions are fastest. In fact, there's about $12 trillion saved if we go for a fast transition. And part of the reason is because these technologies come down extremely quickly with so-called learning rates. The more we do them, the cheaper they get. And then the more we do, more. Okay, so the learning rate for solar panel, well, let me start. The learning rate for the Model T Ford, when we put them on conveyor belts, for every doubling of Model T Fords on the roads, you reduce the price by about 14 to 15%. For solar panels, that's between 20 to 27%. And so that's why we've seen these massive declines. So if we put in this effort now, we get lower and lower costs in the future, and we bring these costs down so that the overall transition cost is also cheaper. But the problem is that we've left this so late that all the infrastructure around this transition is incredibly difficult to do now. We need to roll things out at a massive scale. If we had done this in a slower, sort of gradual, more planned way, it wouldn't be so interruptive to everyday life. So for example, transmission. Transmission is pretty much a no-regret scenario in every single energy model that you look at, and yet it's incredibly difficult to build still. It's incredibly difficult because of the permitting and the planning process, and it's just not getting done. One report last year suggested that the EU is about 7 years behind where it needs to be in terms of rolling out transmission, for example. Now, again, it's an incredibly cheap system if we're able to do it, but we have to get around some of these social issues. So we've turned what could be technological solutions into social problems because we've left things so late. Another example is heat pumps in insulation, and insulation schemes in the UK has been a little bit of a disaster. In fact, housing building regulations have been a little bit disaster for a long time. In fact, we built many millions of homes when we knew all of this was a problem, and now we're going to have to renovate them all. I think something that Lord Deben was saying, something of the order of 2 million homes or so. And of course, transportation. So, it's all very well having all these technologies, but actually a lot of these different transportation types will be a lot healthier for us, be a lot better for us, would be time savers, more social, better for our health. One thing I did want to highlight is this concept that the energy transition includes huge amounts of mining around the world. Aren't we just swapping one thing for another? And we performed what I think is the first published scientific analysis of the amount of mining needed for the energy transition. And what you can see on the left here is we've got the total amount of ore extracted globally. Now, in the different colors, we've got red is coal, and we've got the other technologies in blue, different blues and green, and some other infrastructure. And what you see is the amount of coal that we already mine today is huge. And so when we actually look at the entire energy transition, we would actually reduce the amount of mining activity through this transition. And if we are able to also substantially improve recycling technologies, we could reduce the amount of mining activity for just coal, not even taking into account other energy sources. We could reduce the amount of mining activity by half. Now, that also means that we have a stock of value in our society. I think this is something that's really often missed. At the moment, we're doing all this mining, we're taking it away, we're burning it, and we're just disappearing it up into the atmosphere, and we're losing it. The future energy system will be a stock of resources, of materials in our society that will be incredibly valuable to us and will continue to recycle. Thermodynamically, we can't recycle everything, but 95% is something that we should aim at in terms of the recycling of those materials. And you can imagine what that means for energy security, for geopolitical stability. The other thing I want to point out here was some other work that we looked at how much the stationary storage in electric vehicles could actually contribute to short-term energy storage. And we found that actually, if you add in the amount of vehicles on the road in the future, and also the amount of secondary batteries that are taken out of the old cars, that you could meet all the short-term storage requirements globally by just using electric vehicle batteries by 2030. So this idea that we don't have this storage capacity as well is something that is not necessarily true. The issues, as always with these things, are the social arrangements to actually make this happen. So that cars are bidirectional, so that we're able to recover these batteries, so that we can put these on the grid. These are organizational problems, these are not technical problems. There's one final thing I want to point out here, in case anybody thinks I think everybody should get an EV or something. We wanted to show the very worst case scenario here for the energy transition. So all of these lines suggest pretty much the biggest amount of materials you could want for the energy transition. EVs for everybody type sort of scenario, just to be as difficult to ourselves as possible. Now, of course, if we have public transport, then and we have other approaches for mobility, then this would come down rapidly as well. That was globally. That's global figures. Yeah, and the other thing I should really mention is we are going to be shifting areas where we're extracting fossil fuels to areas where we're extracting these materials. And I'm not for 1 minute saying that we don't need to pay a lot of attention to where those things are happening in the communities that are going to be affected by that. But what I do want to say is we want to keep that in mind in terms of the harms of the current system, in terms of the harms of the future system. Okay, Now, the issue being, in the cow in the room here, as we'll go on to talk about, is that even if we were to do the entire energy transition, the food system transition on its own would be enough to push us beyond 1.5 degrees. Let's face it, most things are now, but even beyond potentially 2 degrees of warming, and that's also research from Oxford. So we need this great food transition or great food transformation of our food systems. And this consists of mainly 3 areas: dietary change, a reduction in food waste, and improvements in production. Now, if we look across food impacts on the environment, I would say that food systems in general are the biggest single driver of most of our environmental issues. So these are the famous planetary boundaries. Many of you have seen this in the room already. These are boundaries for different aspects of environmental impacts: land use change, biodiversity, climate change, and how far beyond the limit of a sustainable planet we are for each of these areas. And if we move around them, we look at food systems. Food systems are the second biggest driver of climate change, the first biggest driver of biodiversity loss, the first biggest driver of land system change, the first biggest driver of freshwater change, the same as for nutrient flows, which kills life in waterways. The second biggest driver is acidification, and the second, or moving into the first biggest driver of aerosol loading, because we've got rid of a lot of coal in Europe and the EU and in the US, the proportion being driven by agriculture is actually getting higher and higher. It's about 50% across the EU now, so about half now. So this is quickly moving into the first place for food systems. And for novel entities like plastics, it's obviously very high. And food systems are the biggest driver of zoonotic diseases. I think, another pandemic is really in a matter of time. Didn't say it would be an uplifting presentation, this one. But if we make these changes, we can actually reduce this a lot. And is likely the biggest driver of antimicrobial resistance. And mostly all of this across this entire board is driven by animal agriculture. And in a large part, that's just simply due to the efficiency of the system. If we look at energy electrification and moving towards an electrified energy system, we're typically reducing the amount of energy that we need by about 60% because those systems are just so much more efficient. An electric car will use about 80% of the energy it gets, whereas an internal combustion engine car will use about 16% usefully of the energy it gets. And it's kind of similar in the food system. I mean, if you look across different animal products, you're throwing away between 80% to 97% of the calories that are in those products. Just a little plug here, we've got a textbook on food and sustainability, which is interdisciplinary across different areas, if you want to check that out. So this is a little picture of work we're doing at the moment on biodiversity and carbon loss. This is showing both on the same figure here. So as we go up on the left, and those colors, we see higher biodiversity loss, and on the right, we see higher carbon loss, and then areas where we see both are in this deep red. So you can see the scope of the agricultural system around the world on biodiversity and carbon loss. The big thing to point out here, and again, this is work from Oxford, is that shifting to a plant-rich diet, especially in high-income nations, is the biggest opportunity that we have for meeting climate targets. We can see here moving from different interventions from business as usual across to higher efficiencies. We can see that plant-rich diets, this is on a global level, but it's even a higher impact in the high-income nations, about 75% reductions we could get in high-income nations for plant-rich diets. And this would save vast amounts of land. Around 75% of agricultural land is used for livestock, and that's around 35 to 40% of the total habitable land. If the UK ate a plant-rich diet, we would save an area almost the size of Scotland. This is some work that we did where we looked at what would happen if people in high-income nations ate a mainly plant-based diet. So there's still some meat in there, and there's quite a bit of milk actually still in there. But you're talking about like a smallish burger once every 2 weeks. That's sort of that level of meat consumption. And we looked at what would happen in terms of the land that you would save upstream from those changes. And we found that in high-income nations, you would save an area roughly the size of the EU if you were to have this shift. If you were able to save that land and return it to natural vegetation, you'd draw down about 14 years of global agricultural emissions. It's a huge amount. Now, the other way to think of that is as a double dividend. So if you think about moving from meat consumption to, say, legume consumption, you get that reduction, but you get the same reduction again if you're able to save that land that the animals were on and then draw down onto that land. So we can start to see some pictures like this in our landscapes. If we can work with producers, suppliers of food, if we can work with consumers and see this future. And I really think this is a story of opportunities, because just think about the floodwater retention. I mean, we've just seen storm birds. Think about the floodwater retention that we could have through this transition, the biodiversity benefits, the storm surge absorption. As you increase the roughness, surface roughness of the planet, if you increase more vegetation, you actually take the edge off the storm surges and the wind that you get. So you'd actually reduce that too. You'd have more space for alternative food production methods. I mean, if you want these really nice, really good ways of producing food, it's going to take some more land, less intensive, and it would free up land for that. And we'd have great food diversity. So the way that I think about this, if you save an area almost the size of Scotland, just think about all the network of parks that could be connected up through the communities, through the entire country, and have all of those connections for species to move between them, to cope with the punches of climate change, the access to nature, and the improvements in mental health that we have in the country. This is work that we did to look at what would happen if the EU alone moved towards this diet that I mentioned. A little bit of meat, a fair bit of dairy, but very plant-based. And we found that on the whole, you would be able to account for almost all of the Russian and Ukrainian exports, two major food producers, by this shift, because we're reducing how much grain we're feeding to animals and food that we're feeding to animals. And I think this is a story of opportunities. I think this really is something that we always have to lean on, is that this research shows that one of the most effective ways to encourage people to change in any way is to give people options. So we know that putting more of these alternatives on menus improves the chance that even meat eaters start eating these options. You know, talking about environment's one thing. Unfortunately, you know, people aren't persuaded by that as much as you think. It's often about health, animal welfare, and environment sort of comes down a little bit lower in terms of putting on labeling, for example. So one of the interesting questions that I think we are looking at here in Oxford for my next 4 years is looking at how do you help these food system transitions out. If we know we need these transitions from an environmental perspective, if we also know that they would be better from a health perspective, and if we also know that they would be better for rolling with the punches of climate change and protecting biodiversity, then what is it that needs to change? So we did some work earlier this year to look at the embodied subsidies in different products across the EU. So we looked at common agricultural subsidies, and we can see here on the left that we've got the different subsidies that are involved in different types of production. So in the red, we've got the animal-based subsidies, and in the green, we've got the plant-based subsidies. Now, because most of the subsidies are for direct payments on the amount of land that you have, and because animal agriculture takes up a lot of land, it's not necessarily surprising, but it doesn't change the fact that the embodied subsidy at the end of the line, when you're paying for that, is coming through this system. And this is the largest single item in the EU budget. It's about a third of the EU budget is the common agricultural policy. So in this case, as with fossil fuel subsidies, we're actively supporting disaster. Now, if we have a look at the subsidy intensity across different products, we can see that the largest ones are, of course, the bovine meat and these ruminants, as so often discussed in these sorts of discussions. Now, a second question is, if you sort of understand where the subsidies are going and you want to sort of start shifting that and you want to get down to the regional level and help farmers out with different options, everybody likes options. So giving farmers different options for how to manage land with enough subsidy, which is what is happening now in the environmental land management schemes in the UK to varying degrees of success, is one of the main options. But we've also got this big assets problem. Now, farmers have built up a lot of assets over time, and they put buildings, machinery, equipment in. And so we're doing some work now to look at what does this transition imply for farmers and those assets. And we can see the assets here on the left. Now, one of the interesting things I think to point out here is, again, we've got the assets in red for animal agriculture, and then we've got the assets for feed in yellow. And so you can see that there's actually some substantial amount of assets in the cropland production system that are also at risk of stranding if we have this transition. Now, I should say if we have this transition, my own feeling is that this will happen one way or another. Either climate change will get so difficult and we will have so many impacts on cropland systems, we will not be able to afford luxuries like animal products, and then they'll disappear anyway. But maybe we can get ahead of it and actually become more resilient in the meantime. We can get ahead of it and get ahead of doing that damage. And this is what it would look like for different dietary transitions in the amount of assets. And we're talking hundreds of billions here. So these are significant assets. Now, because agricultural assets are depreciated quite quickly, we looked at different ways in which you might be able to depreciate those assets. And there are opportunities to depreciate those assets. So there's not so many stranding of assets at the end of the line. But it does need joined up policy again. We've left it so late that we need joined up policy in so many different areas and so many different domains. In the interest of time, I'm just going to skip this one, because I'd like to talk a little bit about why are things so slow. So if all of this is quite wonderful for food, for nature, for health, for the environment, why aren't we doing it? And one of the major reasons are vested interests. What I've got here on the left is the amount of investments from Shell in 2021. They spent 18.3 billion euros on investments. Now, Shell says that around 3 billion of that was green, but the EU suggests that, according to their estimates, actually about 500 million, 1.5 billion was green. If you look within that, though, you can see that that was on wind and solar, hydrogen and biofuels, and nature carbon capture and storage. Now, there's two things here that are good. There's one thing here that's good, and two things here that's bad. There's two things here that allow Shell to continue operating, and there's one thing that actually indicates a proper transition. And this proper transition, probably they're spending about 1-ish% on wind and solar, and this was back in 2021 before they even lowered their targets for that. So David King was talking last night, actually, that he was in a number of different talks when he was talking about talking at different countries before Paris, and he said there was always the same person in the back of the room. You're only presenting one side of the argument. There's another side of the argument here, and it was the same person no matter which country he went to. Remarkable. And these people are extremely good. Honestly, the vested interests that are currently sort of opposing a lot of these changes, the reason they're good is because they're marketing. They know how to do this. They know how to advertise. And I say we as scientists don't, and I'll move on to that in a little bit in a second. Now we're starting to see the build-up of meat and dairy pushback. I think meat and dairy is basically sort of 10 years behind where we were with fossil fuels. So this study here, which I recommend everybody read the executive summary, New Merchants of Doubt by the Changing Markets Foundation, they found that, very specifically, the same PR firms that got involved with oil and gas, got involved with tobacco, are now getting involved with meat and dairy. And what they're doing, I mean, it's so incredibly clever. What seems to be happening is there's a lot of investment in social media targeted at younger ages, which you never really saw for the fossil fuel industry. But they know that actually if you get people young, then that really affects sort of their dietary patterns, and their dietary patterns become stickier. So they know it's incredibly cynical. Just to put a couple of other things where we've tried to make efforts to push back on some of the meat and dairy sort of promotion out there. I don't really have time to go into that, so I'll leave that. Another thing I do want to point out here, in terms of going so slow, is the massive inequality in the world. And many of you may have seen this on the left. This is work that showed the tons of CO2 equivalent per person per year for different income earners. So we go from the bottom 50% here up to the top 1%, which is around that 100 tons per capita on the right. But what I wanted to do here was just show what this would look like on our emissions if we didn't change anything else other than just bring down these footprints. Now, what I'm going to do here is lower this to the level of the average European footprint. So I don't think the average European has a sort of terrible life, really, definitely not globally. So let's have a look at what that looks like. As we bring down the emissions of the top 1%, around 30% reduction of the top 1% alone could reach 2030 targets. And as we go down to the average EU footprint, you can see how much closer we're getting to 1.5 degrees here. Now, I should say that there are some nuances in these data. You know, the investments are often the investments involved in the top 1% are often quite big. They're often quite fossil heavy. And so there's some nuances in terms of what they can do as individuals in terms of their individual actions compared to what they can do through their financial systems. But still, I want to just show the scale of that change. So how fast can we change? Well, often we get these tipping points. They're commonly sort of thought of as pushing, and then suddenly things change, and you get over the side of the hill. But unfortunately, I put in a little extra man here of groups that are trying to push back the boulder in the other direction. And I wouldn't say that necessarily we are at the tipping point for food system transitions yet, but we certainly are for energy transitions. And we've seen massive changes. I mean, I haven't lived in the country for 20 years, so I've been back and forth, but like actually living here is a different thing. And now sort of seeing how the different sort of the supermarkets have changed, how the country has changed has been really fascinating to me. But one thing's for sure, when I left around 20 years ago, you'd never see sort of plant-based milks in the supermarket. I mean, that was sort of unheard of. This is per capita meat consumption in Germany, which seems to be on a bit of a secular decline at the moment. This is the amount of climate cases around the world. Now, of course, Trump has, you know, put a freeze on that, perhaps, potentially. But you can see that massive increase. And this is a lovely picture of where I just came from, because I moved over from the Netherlands. And you can see back in the 1970s there what the streets look like compared to today. And I know which one I'd like to live in. And we've seen in Paris, actually more recently, a rapid transition that was even faster. So we've seen over about 5 years a massive transition of the city towards cycling and towards different infrastructure that's better for us and better for the environment. We also underestimate our neighbours. And so I think this is something we always have to bear in mind, because I'm really, really guilty of this. I sometimes get really negative about like the chance and the scope for other people to change and what other people think. But this is a study that looked at about 6,000 people across the US from all sorts of different political stripes. And they asked them all of these questions along the bottom. Are you worried about climate change? Are you worried about carbon tax? Are you, are you supportive of 100% renewable energy? And they also asked them, what do you think the percentage of your fellow national compatriots are in supporting this? So they said, what do you think the average American support is for a carbon tax, for example, the filthy word in the US as far as I understand? And the estimate was about 32%. So the general sort of median here was that 32%, they thought 32% of people across the country supported a carbon tax. But the actual level of support was usually double what they thought. So they looked at what everybody actually really wanted, and it was always double. And we sort of see this over and over again, is that we kind of underestimate our neighbours. We can see that in the climate change assembly that we had in the UK, for example, where you got sort of 108 people from across all sorts of different backgrounds, and they came up with stuff that's far beyond what the politicians are talking about, even today, with an ostensibly more green government in. So we're talking about banning SUVs. I mean, that was one of the most remarkable ones, but also talking about reductions in meat, frequent flyer levies, all of these components. Now, do we also underestimate scientists? I think this is an important thing for many scientists in the room here. A colleague of mine, a friend of mine, recently wrote a paper about the climate change engagements of scientists. And what they did was they talked to over 9,000 scientists across the world, and they looked at advocacy and their responses to whether the scientists should be involved in advocacy. And we go from strongly disagree here to strongly agree at the top. First question, scientists and academics should engage more in advocacy. Pretty strong support there. Scientists and academics should engage in more legal protest. Engaging in advocacy, and I think this is the important one, would diminish scientists' credibility. There's this concern that somehow, we'd be seen as not credible if we get involved in advocacy. And actually, 35% strongly disagreed with that, and 42% disagreed with that. That's a real minority thought that there would be any impact on credibility. I think this is also very, very revealing in terms of what the scientists also wanted. So this is engaging in climate advocacy. 58% would be willing to. It's quite remarkable. 29% already do. But what that 58% to me is that there's a huge untapped reserve for scientists to be out there defending the scientific consensus on all sorts of different fields, in all sorts of different areas, because they're willing to, but they're not currently getting involved. And there could be all sorts of institutional barriers. It's not just putting one extra thing on the plate to do, of course, but there is a lot of interest, and if there are organizations out there that can support scientists, that would be great. Participating in climate change related protests. I thought this was interesting. Participating in non-violent disobedience actions, actually a very large majority there. And of course, Carl Sagan comes to mind when we think about all of this as one of the first people to do this and do this well. So I think we have a very real race between feedbacks, between the bad feedbacks. The AMOC is one of the big ones, the ocean current, which has a huge impact on the UK. I mean, after a tipping point, one paper suggested we could actually find the cessation of arable farming in the country. So we need to get onto this food system transition even faster. In society, we're seeing a worrying backsliding of democracy at the moment. And our adaptive capacity, there's these feedbacks in adaptive capacity as we put more and more expenditure in to deal with the impacts when we could have actually adapted to them for much less money. One study, for example, found that for every £1 that we spend on floodwater protection, it pays back £6. And that would be by the end of the century under a higher warming scenario, but it's a good value for money. Compared to these good scenarios, that as the cost of technology comes down, more people do it, more we build more, that comes down even further, it brings it more available. I mean, I often say that we've got to thank the Germans and the Chinese for making solar cheap for everybody, because it was the relationship between the feed-in tariffs in Germany and spending that extra amount of money back then when it was quite expensive, and China bringing the cost down, that has bring the cost down for everybody. I mean, that's removing a bit of nuance, of course. There's lots of other countries that did invest, but Germany did it in a big way. We know that as more people eat plant-based diets, we know that more plant-based options have become available. We know that people start to choose them because they're exciting. It's not a story of cutting things out. It's a story of trying new things out, trying out. I mean, we only eat a handful of plants, maybe tens of plants every week, and we could be choosing from hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of plants. And the same with legal cases. I mean, as we get more and more legal cases, we have more and more opportunities for discovery, more and more evidence of the mendaciousness of different industries, and then we can bring more and more legal cases against them. One thing I wanted to highlight today, what we can do today, we were in Parliament yesterday for the Climate and Nature Bill, which is currently going through Parliament. If you scan the QR code here, you can write to your MP, and the Climate and Nature Bill, it's very simple and so important. All it does is it puts into a law our international, what we've said we'll do internationally, and it asks for a citizens' assembly. That's the two things. So how could you argue with that? Well, at least the MPs will probably will, but we'll try to make that very compelling. Okay, and so just to finish off here, I think there's an important lesson about communication that I think I've learned through the years, is that I think it's important to be honest. I don't go in for this not telling the truth. I don't go in for this idea that we shouldn't be talking about just how scary things are. We should be alarmed, but we need to give the solutions. We can't just leave it at that. And we need to repeat. We need to learn from the industries that have done so well in promoting the anti-scientific information. And so we need to repeat simple stories. I mean, often it's said that, you know, the first time you're completely sick of saying the same thing again, you know, is the first time somebody else is hearing it. And that's actually how it works. So you've just got to keep doing it. I'm changing KISS, keep it simple, stupid, to keep it simple, scientists. We don't have to be non-scientific or not express in inaccurate ways. What we need to do is talk about the consensus and the consensus across different fields, and not get stuck down in the sort of into the minutiae. And yes, I'll leave it there. I'm just going to mention, you know, obviously there's a lot to talk about. This is one of the reasons why I did write a popular science book about this, with paired chapters of pessimism and hope, which is a little bit like the structure today. So don't ever sort of leave the book reading just, if you do read the book, don't leave the book just on the pessimistic chapter, because that's a bit of a disaster. Make sure you have time to read both chapters so you don't feel horrendous. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I have questions, and I'm going to start off by one, if I may. So I really like what you said at the end about what scientists should do, what researchers should do. And I consider myself a scientist advocate as well. But how should we advocate, given that when we advocate, we're sort of using our authority as experts in the field, but we're also bringing in our worldview as well. And I worry about what's happening at the States at the moment, where science in general is being portrayed as synonymous with a particular worldview that's antipathetic to much on the Republican right. And so this is feeding back to undermine the core science as well as our advocacy.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, it's a really good question. I think personally it's very important to keep separate, those both, and to be clear in your communication. So when I was talking about the mining, for example, I said, it's not necessarily a future I want to see. That's my personal statement. But this is what the science says for the scenarios that we looked at. And even then, there's a reduction. So I think it's important to express that in whatever you can. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a position statement. The second thing I want to say is that actually, it's a very, very well-organized, slick machine that's doing that.
Yeah.
And they could take any, and you could take any clip from what I just mentioned and say, hey, look at this guy, he's a tofu munching, whatever it was, liberal, which is not, that's not what I'm talking about in terms of the scientific consensus here. So I think in some cases we don't really have much of an option. It will be weaponized anyway, but it's important for us to keep our own perspective.
I agree, we have to do it, but we do it carefully with our eyes open.
Yeah.
Couple of questions, one in the front here. And I'm afraid it will just be a couple.
Thank you.
And please make them very short.
You didn't mention the...
Sorry, microphone.
You didn't mention the problem with ecological overshoot and the fact that we're way over the carrying capacity of Earth at the moment. And I was hoping you might talk about mindset shift, because at the moment, profit is driving all our business incentives.
Yeah.
And if we were looking for equitable degrowth economically to get back within the carrying capacity of work of the Earth, that would involve a totally different mindset.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, I think my attitude on this is that some of these changes that we'll see here will encourage some of the things that people want from that. I think we can all agree on what kind of world that we want to look at, but I think there's a lot of different ways of getting there. And I think in general, for people who are ecologically concerned, I think we need to be singing from the same hymn sheet as much as possible. We can have our disagreements on things like degrowth or A-growth. I'm quite a fan of A-growth, because actually some of these massive infrastructure developments that we would need to see the changes fast enough might actually increase growth in the very short term and then reduce in the longer term. I don't have any sort of dog in the race there, but I do think it's important that we were all pulling towards that. And I think that a lot of the transitions that we see here will actually ultimately democratize energy, democratize food systems. It will actually mean that we do end up addressing some of those issues with profits and corporate concentration.
Thank you.
Thanks. So from things like, I guess, other ways of creating protein, so specifically lab-grown meat or precision fermentation, do you see those things currently being a sort of complete red herring? And perhaps 5-10 years' time, do you see them actually making a meaningful difference to climate change?
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah. No, I mean, I don't see them as a red herring. Again, I'm fine with it. Ultimately, we need to get these things sorted so quickly. Anything works. I would rather not see the corporate capture of some of these technologies, and I think that's where the biggest thing comes from. But they will have an impact. And they may have a really big impact depending on how public acceptance of them goes, how the technology goes, how they're developed, and what support there are for them. And I think, if you look at the environmental impacts, yes, they're better. So I don't think that they're a red herring in the same way as I think that carbon capture and sequestration is, and the amount of investment in that, I think, is a disaster at the moment. And we will need that eventually. We should just pay for that later. And we should just get on with doing the 80% that I showed earlier in terms of the energy transition.
Thank you.
It's a big question, but what's going to be the impact of AI on all of this? Do you know?
Oh,
Thank you.
yeah. I mean, yeah. Who knows? I think if anybody thinks they do know, I think there's a lot of. I don't think they do, because you know there is. You know, there's some mathematical papers out there that show actually, you know, we might not see this exponential takeoff, and actually AI and moving towards sort of a higher and higher levels of intelligence in AI actually might asymptotically phase off. And part of the reason of that is the amount of training data that we actually have in the real world for the number of use cases that we can use it. So, you know, it's not an area of my research, but at least as far as I know, there's a lot of discussion about how useful it could be.
And if you didn't see it, do look at the event we did with Nigel Shadbolt a few weeks back, precisely on that. There's a question there, Clara.
Yes, I'm even a meat eater, as you described. Just wondered, on the food transition, whether you thought that the current food transition that's going on in the UK, holistic, regenerative agricultural system, so a total change from the industrial agricultural system, where that plays in your modelling?
It sort of depends if it's sort of what you mean by regenerative. I think there's a lot of different things that come under that umbrella, and it's not super clear to me exactly all the different things. Now, some of it obviously has a huge impact. You know, no-till farming, you know, there's things that can be done in the fields, but ultimately because of the just general size and scope of animal agriculture in the country, that will have to come down quite dramatically. It doesn't mean that we have to get everything out. It just means that we're going to have to reduce that a huge amount if we're actually going to meet some of the biodiversity and climate targets. We can talk about that a little bit longer because that's a really long conversation. Yeah.
Thank you. Question there, and then at the back.
Two very simple questions. One is the cost of conflicts, for example, in the Middle East and Ukraine. And the second is, are you able to do realistic simulations of the effects of Trump in the next few years?
Yeah, good questions. The first one in terms of costs and emission, you mean the emissions of conflict? Yeah, destruction. Yeah, so you can look at that. I mean, so we looked at that in terms of some of the material impacts and some of the emissions. And you know, it's small worldwide. I mean, the human tragedy is much larger than the environmental tragedy there. Although I should say that, you know, global military spending would be easily way more than enough to actually do the entire energy, climate, and the biodiversity transition. So we're in the couple of trillions in terms of that. On the Trump, who knows what Trump will do? Who knows whether Trump knows what he will do? And there are people who are rapidly trying to model what would happen in this scenario, or that scenario. But I think the future is very divergent there.
I think you need a random number generator.
Yeah.
Question right at the back.
Hi, I may have missed it, but could you say something about where fish fit into your food transition?
Yeah. Yes. So, yeah. I mean, fish. I think is my own perspective on this is that I think it's overblown as an idea for blue protein. It's very important around the world for many different communities, but I don't think it's something that's necessary for high-income nations in any great volumes in the way that I think is being driven by some interests there.
Question then, which I'm afraid will be our last one.
Question about vegetables.
A bit louder, please.
On the topic of vegetarian diets, although without being
much closer to your mouth.
Without being too prescriptive. So I'm a vegetable grower, and it occurs to me that do you think enough importance is placed on the how and the where of horticultural production? Because, you know, a lot of energy can be wasted transporting things around in refrigerated trucks and keeping them in fridges.
Thank
Whereas,
you.
Yeah.
you know, peri-urban market gardens are much more effective at supplying.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, so the first thing on the transport emissions, they are pretty small for the food system, unless you're flying them, which is a total disaster. That's about 1%, and actually it's going up, so we need to be careful about that. It's a shocker. But in terms of transportation emissions, they're sort of the order of anywhere between 5 and 12%, depending on the study. Some higher ones out there that I think have some problems. But on the, you know, how and where, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You know, in the UK, we've got a lot of these these disused greenhouses. And just coming from the Netherlands, where we've got like huge areas full of greenhouses, I think that's quite remarkable that there's been this sort of undermining, or there's been lack of support for horticulture over the years, which I think will have to come back. And in terms of where, I mean, there's lots of areas that are good. Now, one of the things that I should mention is, and that still comes up quite a lot, is yes, we have this transition, but don't we need to grow loads more beans and pulses, and don't we have to just have so much more land for that? It's tiny, it's marginal. We don't even see it in the model, it's so tiny. In those figures, they were actually in those figures, but it that it's just impossible to even see how much extra, because the system is so inefficient now. So actually we could continue to grow most of the stuff in most of the places that we're growing already.
So many apologies to the people who wanted to ask questions. The one thing we guarantee at the OMS is that we finish on time. Paul, are you about for a bit if people want to come
absolutely,
up?
Absolutely.
So please do come up and talk to Paul. I'd like to thank two people. First, of course, Paul, for giving a really super talk and for sort of leavening the amorphous doom, which I thought was a great phase, with some real ideas about what needs to happen in the future. But I'd also like to thank Clara. Clara, could you wave your hands at the back? This is the last OMS event of the term, and it's Clara's last event. For 6 years, I think, she's looked after us on these events. Forgive me, I have the time wrong, and has done a really super job. So we'll miss you, Clara, and thank you for everything that you've done for us. So a round of applause for both Paul and